Alright guys, welcome to the first video, which is a very brief, quick introduction. Not comprehensive, but just to kind of get your feet wet to the Grasshopper interface. Now, if you take a look first at the Canvas site, hopefully this is somewhat similar to what you'll see, but all the stuff that we'll be sort of working with in the following weeks, you will find here in the module section, right? So if you go to the module section, you'll see the content for that week. And usually there will be a content page and eventually also a file, a sort of objectives file that tells you what we're trying to accomplish or what you should try to do for that week. And so if you go into the GH intro to the page, you'll find it's laid out right now sort of like this. Eventually, this is because this is what I'm recording right now, eventually you'll see the embedded YouTube videos here for the two videos that are planned for this week. Now, first off, I want to show you or just walk you through some of this. The first website up here is the official Grasshopper website. It looks like that, right? Pretty simple. This is where you will find the latest Grasshopper build. So if you go download latest version, it will ask you for your email. You know, put it in, and then basically that will give you. It will allow you to download the latest Grasshopper build. Funny thing is that you'll see there's no Mac version yet. It does not exist, right? Just probably too many people have asked, so they've just decided to put it up there. But eventually they will. Okay, eventually they will. So that's the Grasshopper website. The second website I'm linking here is this one, which is the Food for Rhino website. And these are basically plugins or apps for Rhino and Grasshopper. Up here you'll find the Rhino plugins, down here you'll find the Grasshopper add-ons. We'll be using a little bit of both. A lot of people, there's a lot of really great tools that you can find here, and you can just do a search. Now, I'm logged in right now, but if you're not, you will actually have to make an account with them to be able to access all this content. But it's free, just like make an account, give your email and a password, and that's it. And so one of the plugins, one of the Grasshopper add-ons or plugins that we will be using here, and you actually see here it sorts things by last updated, most downloaded, and best rated. So for example, most downloaded, one of the ones we're actually going to use this week in the intro is the Lunchbox plugin. And so you can either do that or you can just like type here, search Lunchbox, it should pop up. The Lunchbox plugin, if you click on it, the website's a little slow. If you click on it, it will give you a description, who wrote it, blah, blah. And if you're logged in, then you can actually download it from here. This is just going to show you where to find stuff. It will tell you what tools there are. Eventually, when you sort of start out on your own and are kind of looking for different things. But for our purposes, those two files, the basic Grasshopper installation file here, and the Lunchbox, the latest Lunchbox installer, I've linked here on the Canvas website. So you can download these directly if you need. Now, the school's Sakai's version of Grasshopper might not be the latest, so it's probably a good idea to just download these and install it over the school's version, the Lunchbox installer as well, right? So just do that. Here, this is just a reference document which you can refer to. It's a really great sort of resource PDF written by the guys at ModeLab. And it actually kind of does a sort of quick overview of Grasshopper in the sort of PDF format. And so it goes a little bit more in depth at once, so you might be overwhelmed if you look at it, trying to kind of read it cover to cover. But it's a good sort of reference material, right? So we'll be actually maybe pulling some things from here as well as we go. But there are some very sort of concise and easy to understand explanations of some of the UI elements and things over here. So eventually we'll go back and kind of talk about these things. But I'm just linking them here so you know it's there. Download it, and you can refer back to it from time to time. And there's also a file with some other Grasshopper examples. Right? Now the file we'll be using here today, you'll see that I've linked a 3DM file, which is a Rhino file, and a JPEG. Now the JPEG is going to look like this. And this is basically the JPEG image output of the Grasshopper definition we will be building. And I will give you that first as a reference so you know where we're going. And then the following week, then I will actually upload to here, right here, below here, I will actually upload the completed definitions for, just in case you want to see my version or if there's any difference. But it should be the same. As long as you follow the instructions, you should have basically the same thing. All right, so let's get started. Now, if you open the Rhino file, you should get something that looks like this. If you have Grasshopper installed, all you have to do is type Grasshopper right into the command line. Now, it will load something like this, and this is what it should look like. Right? When it loads, it looks like that. Note that you can actually close it, and it just disappears, but it's still loaded. You just have to type Grasshopper again to bring it back. It doesn't actually close, it just hides itself. As long as your Rhino is open, Grasshopper will also be open as well. Okay? Now don't worry if some of your files or icons don't look like the same, because I have a lot more other random crap installed. Especially this obscure components. Yours by default should look a lot shorter, right? You won't have as many icons as I do here, but this is basically because I have the obscure components on, right? So I have a lot more. It basically shows the full range of everything that I have. That's basically dummy mode, right? So first off, you'll see on the top the sort of file edit menus, right? Support versions, where do you find the version of Grasshopper you're running, etc., etc. It's worth noting preferences here. There's a lot of sort of display preferences and things that you can sort of tweak, but we won't really get into these unless they're absolutely necessary eventually. Okay. And on the top, you'll actually find a lot of the components sorted into their respective tabs. So these are called essentially component palettes. These icons are shortcuts. If you click on this little arrow here, then you can actually see the pull down for the full icons and their full names, as well. When you hover over it, it will give you a quick sort of description of what that thing does. So this is geometry, primitives, input, and utilities, right? And then these are mostly organized or sorted in logical ways. So these are the math-related icons, sets, vectors, curve, surface, right? Mesh, intersect, which are more like operations, transforms, and some of displays. Everything from here on, these are all basically add-ons that I've put in because they found them to be useful. So yours should probably end somewhere around here. Display is probably the last sort of tab that you should have by default, eventually, until you install Lunchbox. Okay, so that's what that should look like. And with all these, you can always, you can just know that you can click here, pull it down, and what you do is, for example, if we start with a basic point component container, you can just click here and drag and drop it onto the canvas, which is this part, blank part on the bottom of the screen. So this is a point basically container. Contains a collection of three-dimensional points, right? And if I right-click, then I can just sort of pan, just the same as you do in sort of Rhino with when you hold down the Shift key to pan. So right-click is pan. There is a middle mouse or space bar. Middle mouse space bar brings up the sort of radial menu, where there are some options that you can use to bake, to zoom, specific geometry, blah blah. We'll get to this in a little bit, but that's where you can find that. I tend to actually use shortcut keys for a lot of these things. Okay, so to start out, we're just actually going to try to build that this first parametric arc definition, really quick and easy. Now I'm going to actually just snap this to the side so you can see my Rhino viewport here. And you'll see that this can work basically side by side. Everything in Rhino still works the same way it does. You can still type commands into Rhino and draw things if you need to, right? At the same time while Grasshopper is open. So they basically sort of function side by side just fine. You'll see in here I have input pre-drawn, and this is Rhino geometry, input point 1 and input point 2, okay? And so what I want to do here, and this is actually that first point that we pulled in, right? We basically pulled it onto the canvas. You don't have to actually do this. You can just drag that down and let go. Okay, so that's the same, basically the same operation. Okay, so I want 2 of these. So you can actually Control C, Control V, which copy and paste the same component in if you want to. That's fine. And I select them to these are some sort of organization tools that helps you. Let's say if your components are like this, and you just cross select them. And if you click on that sort of center align button, then it automatically aligns them together like this. Right? I'll select these 2. So one of these is input point 1 or input point 2. So I'm going to highlight by clicking on this component, and when it's yellow, it means like it's missing something, and you'll get this sort of little error bubble on top. Right? I'll right click and go to set one point, right? And then I will just come here and click on that thing, and that basically references the first input point into this container. The Rhino geometry basically serves to inform this point container what coordinates to use, right? So you do the same with here, right click, set one point, and you can click or just like do a crossing selection of that one point. And you'll see that when the points get referenced, you get a X or a cross, right? This is Grasshopper's display of points. Rhino's display of points were those, right? These little small rectangles. Grasshopper's display of points to kind of differentiate are used as these little crosses or little X's. And you also see that when I have a component highlighted or selected in the Rhino viewport, it turns green. Anything that's not selected or not selected is red, right? So selected geometry green, unselected geometry red, right? So that's just a very simple rule of thumb. Okay, so now we have 2 ends of the arc that we're trying to draw. Now we want to basically draw a line between input point 1 and 2. So let's, instead of hunting for a line, this is a trick I use a lot. So a lot of the components in Grasshopper are either versions, variations, duplicates, or they're identical to commands in Rhino. So one of the nice functions here, like instead of hunting through all this, what you can do is you can double click on the canvas, which brings you to this sort of search button, search keyword dialog box. And you can basically just type line, for example, and this basically brings up all the components that are associated with line. So this is the same type of primitive geometry container. That's not what we want. We want this. Create a line between 2 points. So you click there, and that brings it in. You can hover over it. It will tell you what it wants. And on the left side, so Grasshopper logic always works, it's sort of like a flow chart, right? You think of it as a flow chart, it always works from left to right, So it's the sort of data flow of your information is going from this side to that side, like the flow of a river, right? It doesn't really like it when you try to turn back. So on the left side, you will always find the inputs. On the middle, you'll find basically the sort of component-specific description and if there's any component-related functions. And on the right side, you'll find the outputs. And I'm just hovering over these just to kind of show you. Error bubbles, if there are any, and red means that, okay, we don't really have it, it's not working yet, it's not getting any data, right? Empty point parameter. So over these, you can also right click and you'll get, a lot of different options, but we won't worry about that just yet. You'll note that you can actually set the points here directly, but this is just a more verbose way of showing what's happening. So we're just gonna hover over this end node here, right? And you'll see a little arrow pop out and click to sort of drag and connect basically these 2 points in. And once you have these connected, you'll see that automatically this sort of red line shows up, and that is the line that we're working with, right? And remember, this point, because it's a Rhino point, you can actually move the Rhino point around and the Grasshopper will update. All right, so at this point, sometimes I start sort of grouping these things, so I just basically selected what I wanted to group, right? You can, I believe, although I just use the shortcut key, I just select everything and Control G. Control G basically makes a group out of it, and if you click on the sort of in-between space, blank space of the group not on the component, because the components you can still move around, right? But the group is still there. Not on the component, but in the blank space, you can change the sort of group shape, right? If that's something you want to do, right? Okay, so this is the input group. And therefore, with the group selected, I right-click on the group, and here, if you hover over here, this sort of blank space, this is actually the sort of labeling part. So input points. And you'll see it automatically does that. And this is the way I annotate a lot of my Grasshopper definitions. It's kind of makes things easier to understand. All right. So next step, we want to find basically the midpoint of this so we can move it upwards and be able to draw an arc, right? Okay, so what we're going to want to find, well, there isn't an explicit sort of midpoint component. We can go to, let's say, because this is related to a curve, right? So let's go to the curve panel or palette and look at what we have. So there's some utilities, spline, primitives, which are, circles, circle, 3-point, line, arcs, blah, blah. We'll eventually use one of the arcs. But actually, analysis. This is what we're interested in because you're sort of analyzing the object. You're looking at and sort of trying to find its midpoint, right? And there's a lot. Don't get overwhelmed. Eventually, you'll find some are more useful than others, but what we're looking for here is, I believe, this guy, point on curve, right? So the point on curve, let's just pull it in and click again to drop it down. So that's what it looks like. It's actually a slider, right? And its full name, point on curve, or parentheses, curve point. So this is a slider which basically, wherever you slide it, it will evaluate the curve from 0 to 1 end to the other, right? So 0.5 is the midpoint, and I'm having trouble getting it to 0.5 right now. Okay, so let's just pull this in, and you'll see that, right? So that's the midpoint of the line, and you'll see that when I move this around, it goes from one end to the other, right? Fairly simple. Okay, so let's leave it at the midpoint for now, right? Now the next step we're looking at is actually what we want to do here. So if we're trying to get basically an arc that's sort of going up in space, right? Now to get an arc, you need what? A beginning point, an end point, and a midpoint, right? And actually, while we're here in the sort of curve palette, let's look at the primitives. And there's actually a lot of different arcs we can use, right? And all of these you eventually will just have to like, you know, eventually just like pull it in and see, okay, what are the inputs and what basically figure out what sort of geometries you need to give it, right? But we're going to start simple. Base plane, radius, angle, domain. No, that's not what we want. Arc through 3 points, maybe, right? So let's take a look. Oh, okay. A, start point. B, point on arc interior. And C, input. This is what we're looking for, right? This is the kind of arc that we have information for, right? So a lot of the process of learning Grasshopper is basically this, like just kind of getting to know some of these components, and you'll see like, okay, circles, there are a lot of different types of circles you can draw, etc., etc. You know, that's all fine. So this is the arc that we're looking for. Now, because we want an arc that's going up in space, so we actually need to move these points up. So this point in the middle, this midpoint, this guy, we want to move upwards, right? So if we want to move it upwards, what do you think the command would be? Let's take a wild guess. Move. Oh, okay, surprise. So the move component looks like this. This move component asks for, and I'm hovering over the input to find out, right? Base geometry, this is basically the geometry that you want to move, and a translation vector. A translation vector, which basically is a direction and a value, right? A direction and a value. So by default, and actually when I'm hovering over, you'll see by default it actually already has a vector 0, 0, 10, which means by default the translation vector of this is 10 upwards, right? If you're going in spatial coordinate, that means x, y, z, right? So let's just take this point and push it in, right? And you'll see that automatically this point is up there, and basically that is a goes from 0 to 10. That's a vertical translation or movement of 10 units upwards, right? Okay. Now, we can sort of say, oh, we're happy with that. And say, okay, this sort of start point of the arc, end point of the arc, and midpoint, right? So the start point is our first input point right there. So we'll do that, right? The end point is this guy, right, which is the second one on that end, right? And then the midpoint is this guy who's been translated, right? The guy floating up in the air over there. And that's the output geometry, translated geometry. The other is just like what they did, transformation data. And so there you have an arc, okay? Now I'm not super happy with this just quite yet, and you'll see why. Because this is just a fixed number, right? The translation vector is just stuck there. I can't really do anything with it. So what I want to do is actually be able to modify this translation vector. And so actually let's just go to the vector palette and look at what we have. Let's hunt around, right? Let's shop a little bit. So in the vectors palette, field, grid, planes, points, and vectors. Oh, vector. That's what we're kind of looking for, right? And you'll see unit vector, unit x, y, and z. Now the vector we're looking for in particular is unit z, correct? The z is the z-axis, so let's grab one of those. So what this guy looks for is a unit multiplication factor, and this is basically the world z vector. So it's 1, right? In this case, it's 1.0. So if I push this in, it'll actually just be 1 instead of 10. But that makes it easy for us to make a multiplier. And we'll go back to the very first params palette and go into input. And there are two things we can use here. One is a panel, which looks like this. Yours actually might look yellow because I changed my default colors, the panel. Or a number slider. Right, these are the two inputs that we can use for this. The panel, I can double click on it and say, well, 4, for example, and this becomes a number I push into the factor, and basically that changes, right? And by changing the number, 6, say okay, that changes this multiplier as well. It's the same thing basically, okay? Now, that's not so great, not so useful, although for like static inputs, that's what we use. This is much more interesting. This is the slider, the number slider, right? Now the number slider has two sides to it. One side, which is this. If you double click on this, it will bring up, on the left side of the slider, it will bring up this interface where you can modify the slider's parameters. Or if you double click here, you can actually just input, let's say 0.5, the value for the slider. All right. By default, these sliders are, floating point sliders, with however many number of decimal points, going from 0 to 1, right? And we want to modify that, right? So, and actually you can do, a lot of the modifying here, but I tend to just change it here. So we don't want to change the rounding or the accuracy, but we want to change the min and the max of the domain. So we want to change it from 0 to, let's say, 20, and enter. Or you can click on the little green arrow and say OK. So that changes this slider from 0 to all the way to 20, right? And instead of trying to mess around with these decimals, I'm just going to type in like 8 and enter, and that push that in. All right. So now we have basically a parametric arc where the height, and you'll see this actually turns yellow when I change to 0, because this is not an arc anymore, it's basically a straight line, right? And that's why it's passing you, basically giving you an error. And I can move it up to 20, which makes it almost sort of really bulgy balloon. And that's it for actually this definition. You can I often kind of do a little bit of house cleaning at the end of the definition. Let's say select this guy and group it, double click, make it around, and give it a name. So this is the curve point. I annotate my definition just so I know what the hell I'm doing after a while, because when you come back to something after 3 months, it sometimes takes you a while to kind of realize what you were thinking when you're kind of doing the logic of this, right? So to save the definition, you kind of click here, save the current file, and you guys can call it whatever you want, like arc. Arc, right? Say save, and Grasshopper definitions are .gh files. Okay, so these are GH files. When you minimize this, it sort of goes into the corner, and you can pull it back by maximizing it, or double click, close it. Your Grasshopper sort of preview disappears, but it's still there. If I bring Grasshopper back, you'll see that it's actually just there. It's just hidden itself. It's in the background, right? So don't worry about that. This actually toggles the preview from shaded geometry to wireframe to nothing, right? If we had surfaces, then this would kind of make a difference, right? But this is just to kind of get your feet wet, kind of get used to working with this a little bit, and that's it for that first video.